Good afternoon. It is so good to be here. Let me just thank the Cathedral of St. Paul's Dean and Amy McCreath, and a shout out to Brad, who have been so gracious in inviting me here today and helping me to navigate with the many emails and the responses so diligently. I really appreciate it in this busy time. And of course to Reverend Paul, Martha, and Amelia, and everybody at St. Paul's. Joel, thank you all so much. And to my witness in life, my daughter, Dominga, who has been on this journey with me for a very long time. So again, thank you for inviting me to this year's Lenten season series, Practicing Truth. And of course, the theme today, Building Resilience. And I am also led to say, building holy resilience. Drawing on the scriptures, Isaiah 54 through 9, through lived experience, stirring us to a deeper practice of truth. We must urge the churches to come together, to pray, to fight on both their feet and knees. It's time to tell the raw truth. This reading could not be more apropos for what has transpired and is taking place here in the U.S. as well as in the world. My prayer this afternoon, may the hearing of this word stir us today and prepare us for Easter joy. May the people rise in the spirit and in the search of truth to strengthen our faith. It is in the hearing of this message of Christ that the people may believe, and in believing we hope, and through hope we learn, love more perfectly. May we practice telling the whole story, the raw truth, and in that grief, repentance, reconciliation, transformation, and newness build resilience in the effort to go forward together and not one step back. My lived experiences are deeply tied to community, both locally and nationally. It's all I know and all I've ever done in my entire life. My witness, my daughter, sits here, and as we speak about culture, community, and language, I am most comfortable when using the word we. We were raised in a very close-knit community, which in that context would become the environmental fire that would light the passion through pain and purpose that fueled where we have landed on today. We are from a lineage of leaders. This is the entire movement across this nation. We are from an entire lineage of leaders that have gone before me and you, and whose shoulders we stand on, and who have led battles, fought, won victories, and have died for the price of freedom under the most difficult, challenging conditions ever imagined. These are leaders like Marion Kramer, a former SNCC organizer, movement mother of the National Welfare Rights Union in Detroit, and the late Dottie Stevens of East Boston, Johnny Tillman, Fannie Lou Hamer, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, and the new and emerging leaders coming up beside us to take the mantle and lead the call for change. Our task to build a movement from the bottom up that unites the poor and dispossessed. It is our duty, it is our right, and it is our love. We grew up in a community of working poor, mostly Black mothers, who I remember to be one of my first awakening moments. These organizers fought for equal distribution of food in 1967. They chained themselves to the Grove Hall Welfare Office, the Mothers of Adequate Welfare, you see, where Jack Taggart of the Harvard Crimson wrote about this story many years ago. I was too young to join, but heard about them. That effort sparked a 3-day riot in Boston's Roxbury's community, and 15 blocks of the historical Blue Hill Avenue burned. Then, the following year, on this very week, the assassination of Dr. King, where on this day the community was burning for the second time. I remember our community up in arms. I remember the National Guard. And in the face of adversity, obstacles, and every systemic ill connected to the 5 interlocking injustices of poverty, racism, war, and ecological devastation were working overtime. But it wouldn't be until 1968, the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who had the year before spoke on those 3 evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And it would be on this week, 54 years later, that the resurrection of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, would release the Poor People's Pandemic Report on COVID-19. And I just got back from Washington, D.C., where I had a little tiny role in reading a poem entitled "Poverty Has to Go." But moreover, the tragedy and the sadness and the somberness and the silence of our power was palatable and felt throughout the entire weekend, because it didn't have to be this way. Based on these 5 interlocking injustices of poverty, racism, and the war economy, ecological devastation and the denial of health care, and Christian nationalism, just opening the executive summary of that report is chilling. It states that crises do not unfold independent of the conditions from which they arise. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated pre-existing social and economic disparities that have long festered in the U.S. Widespread and equal distribution of wealth, income, and resources prior to the pandemic created the conditions for many of the negative outcomes associated with the virus. The events of this week should move us, should shock us, change our hearts, minds, and actions. The practice of telling the truth isn't always easy. In fact, it can be incredibly challenging and costly. Therefore, we must build up our resilience to stand firm amidst opposition, sacrifice, and hopelessness. Thank you, Dean Amy. Those words, in many respects, were uttered over and over this week. While Dr. Barber, in tears and all of our members of the Cairo Center and repairers of the breach were in full tears of power and resilience, knowing that we're deep in the valley of dry bones and we must continue to rise and move forward together. Our network of leaders comprised of poor, low-wealth speakers, teachers, faith, and moral leaders who are from every front of struggle, from immigration, survival projects, housing and tenants' rights, labor organizers, welfare rights, testifiers, warriors, homeless unions, healthcare struggles, mass incarceration, child welfare. This lineage of folks who are clear, committed, connected, and competent about our task, the task to unite the poor and dispossessed and build a movement from the bottom up. We must tell the raw truth. We are dying from systemic neglect. A few decades ago, I was organizing with the historical National Union of the Homeless. We used to leaflet on the steps of this very cathedral in the 1980s, the mid-1980s. I was cutting myself and cutting my teeth on a newly emerging organizer nationally with a core group who would travel across the country. We would leaflet on the steps here, listen to music, and dance to the Hare Krishna's movement across the street at the fountain. As we were preparing for our founding convention at Harvard School of Divinity in 1988. We were also mobilizing that year for a National Housing Now march in Washington, D.C. We organized in Sacramento and on the riverbeds of New Mexico and in the parishes of New Orleans and as far as Philadelphia, Mississippi, and as far as Chicago, Detroit, and Minneapolis. We would call attention to the fight, the plight, and the insight, and the visibility of the poor and homeless who were living in the subway station, in the grates, on the streets, and in the encampments across this country. We witnessed the most visible effects of poverty, which was among the unhoused. We disrupted the discourse and the stigmatization of homelessness, that we can speak for ourselves, we can teach, we can talk, and we can organize for ourselves. We witnessed poverty, racism, the war economy, and ecological devastation at work as people cried, died, and fought against all forms of injustice. Food insecurity, toxic air, shelter beds, more drug treatment services, health equity, immigration rights, and of course there was still no room at the inn. We had nowhere to live, and the streets became our school of struggle. I am sure Jesus, one of the great organizers and mobilizers of our time, led a movement made up of leaders, preachers, teachers, and abolitionists. These systemic ills must be exposed deeper and uprooted and dismantled. So the practice of telling the truth isn't always easy, but it's necessary to move the needle of this time in this hour in our history, where rumors of wars and people fleeing their homes and homelands, and still without a place to lay their head at night. In the midst of abundance, there is no scarcity here. We must build up our resilience to stand firm amidst opposition, sacrifice, and hopelessness. Jesus' fight was centered on organizing with the poor to fight against an evil empire. The enslaved workers fought to organize against the exploitation of forced labor. And our resistance from these repressive ills, still today, we see have unfolded throughout history in our demand for justice, truth, reconciliation, repair, and transformation of society and the new human being. My family settled at 30 Irving Street in 1868. When they came to Massachusetts Bay Colony, from Canada, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And today, their work and contribution to America is housed at Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., entitled The Sullivan Papers. From a long line of activists, as it says in my great-great-granduncle Charles Henry Sullivan's obituary, officiated by William Trotter. It says he was an advocate for the native peoples. He was a musician and the founder and benefactor of the Boston Victorian Orchestra. And it goes on and on and on. The families here in Boston that had to move and navigate. My family was one of the first families in Roxbury whose whole block of homes were taken by the banks, and they moved us in the housing projects, where my mother never recovered from that. As a little girl who witnessed the National Guard outside of her living room window in 1968 during the riots, witnessing the poverty trauma, and witnessing my mother nearly being stoned by the police when she went outside of the small project door to look for my brothers. And I screamed, and it was slow motion. And something was lit inside of me and many of the mothers in that community who are still here today in our movement. It would be nearly 20 years later that I would meet and join the ranks of homeless organizing running out of the military. And today I am doing the same work after nearly 40 years. It's very telling in this season of Lent, trying to find your way out of the wilderness. We must end poverty. And as I wrap up, today, Massachusetts bears a very long, deep history embedded in slavery, abolition, and the struggle for freedom, liberation, and democracy. Without boring you with the history lesson, we must face the hard cold facts about those left to die and those who are on the fringes and the edges of poverty violence, policy death, and eviction avalanches. In Massachusetts, poverty, it says 36% of people in Massachusetts are poor or low income, a total of 2.4 million residents. This includes 40% of children, that's 649,000, 43% of women, 63% of Black people, 72% of Latinx, and 33% of white. And from 1979 to 2012, income for the top 1% grew by 334%, while income for the bottom 99% only grew 33%. Systemic racism: 67% of the eligible voting age population in Massachusetts turned out to vote in 2016. Out of 4.9 million eligible voters, that includes 66% of 368,000 eligible Black voters, 45% of 397,000 eligible Latinx, and 238,000 eligible Asian voters, 69% of 4.2 million eligible white voters. More than 11,000 residents cannot vote due to felony disenfranchisement. Of the over 9,000 people imprisoned in Massachusetts as of 2017, about 57% are people of color. Black residents of Massachusetts are incarcerated almost 8 times the rate of white residents. Everybody's got a right to live. And I'm sure these numbers have increased because over 20,000 people in Massachusetts are homeless as of 2018. Working at the 2018 state minimum wage, it takes 113 hours of work per week to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. It doesn't have to be this way. This is why we must continue, as Dr. Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris over the weekend spoke loudly, for us to go out and tell the raw truth. We must march, and we declare that we are not turning back now. Dr. King, on the eve of the night before his death, said he had been to the mountaintop, and at the end he had stated, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." So on this day, this eve that rolls down rivers and mighty streams before the preparation, death, the grave, and the risen Savior comes, let us mark time. Let us march. Let us mobilize, and let's organize and commit to the poor, speaking for themselves, leading for themselves, and all of us rallying around this effort to make sure that the left out and the least of these, our declaration to build a beloved community where everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to thrive. Tell the raw truth, people, and we hope to see you all in Washington, D.C. in 2022. So let the redeemed say yes. And that said, my lived experience of social health economic theft is directly related to why we must speak for ourselves and demand that, again, we can live and not die from a death-dealing society that regards the poor as human industrial waste. Let us go out today and tell the whole truth. May this reading be a blessing to our souls, our life, our ears, and may we take action together to go out and tell the raw truth, as Dr. Barber uttered through tears on this past weekend. Forward together and not one step back. Thank you all.